What are the major obstacles preventing the Jewish nation from realizing its destiny?
Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, was born in Budapest in Hungary, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time, in the year Tel Resh Kaf, according to the Jewish calendar, 1860, according to the Gregorian calendar. He was the son of Jewish parents, very assimilated German Jewish parents, and he himself was completely assimilated, completely unconnected to his Jewish heritage until the famous Dreyfus affair. Alfred Dreyfus, an assimilated French Jew, was an officer in the artillery of the French army and was falsely accused of treason because he was a Jew. This took place in 1894 when he was convicted, and he was in fact only exonerated in 1906. The Dreyfus affair, universally recognized as a tremendous injustice, was also the catalyst for bringing many assimilated Jews, such as Dreyfus himself and such as Theodor Herzl, to the belated realization that no matter how assimilated they might be, how much they aspired to be anything but Jewish, no matter how much they desired to be accepted by their fellow Austro-Hungarians or Frenchmen or British neighbors, they would always be seen as Jews and treated and discriminated against as Jews. Herzl's remedy for this problem was Zionism. In other words, accepting the fact that the Jews would never be able to simply live their lives and assimilate quietly into oblivion, as was their true desire. Therefore, there was no option but to gather these Jews together from various countries and establish a Judenstaat, a state of Jews, a state where these Jews, assimilationist Jews, could live out their lives without discrimination, without being constantly reminded that they were unequal or undesirable, so that they could simply exist in a basic biological sense without threat and without hindrance. The aim of Herzl's Zionism was to create the physical conditions that would allow Jews to live in peace without being discriminated against. And therefore, when the British suggested to Herzl that a Jewish homeland be established in Uganda, in Africa, he was very much in favor of this suggestion, and in fact insisted and successfully forced a vote on this subject in the Zionist Congress, which, due to his threats of resignation if this resolution was not to be accepted, was in fact passed. And it was only, in fact, after his untimely death at the age of 44 in 1904 that this decision was reversed by the Zionist Congress. This reversal came about because of the agitation of many of the delegates to the Zionist Congress who hailed from Eastern Europe. There was a very real difference between the delegates of the Zionist Congress who hailed from Eastern Europe and those who came from Western Europe. The movement, as we mentioned, was founded by assimilated Jews from Western Europe or Central Europe. These were Jews who had not been the first to decide upon a path of assimilation. They were born into this. People like Herzl, people like Max Nordau, a German Jew who was married to a non-Jewish woman. Whereas the East European Jews, they were new to this game of assimilation. They were essentially the first generation of Jews to assimilate, actively wish to shed their Jewish background and heritage and create for themselves a new identity. And therefore we find three different types of Jews joining the Zionist movement and supporting its activities. In the first place, we had the assimilationist Jews of Western and Central Europe. On the other hand, we had the assimilationist Jews from Eastern Europe, mainly from Russia. And the third group, by far the smallest, a small minority faction within the Zionist movement, was known as the Mizrahi, that is to say, a religious Zionist movement. Jews who did not wish by any means to relinquish the Torah and the Mitzvot, its commandments and its precepts. These were Jews who were religious and orthodox and observant and wished to remain so, but they also felt that it was essential that the Jewish people create such a safe refuge for Jews from many countries, particularly from Tsarist Russia, who were being persecuted very severely. It should be noted that at this point in time, the early 20th century, the vast majority of Jews around the world were most definitely not Zionist. Most of them felt, in the first place, that this would only lead to an increase in anti-Semitism in their own countries. They preferred to let sleeping dogs lie. It should further be noted that there was a significant sector within the Jewish world that rejected Zionism out of hand, namely the ultra-Orthodox, who correctly perceived from its inception that Zionism was intended to create a new identity for Jews that had nothing to do with Torah-based Judaism. So essentially this was an ideology and a movement which would attempt to uproot the Torah and create a different type of focus for Jews around the world. This opposition of the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community around the world and in Israel has remained unchanged from that time to this. If we ask today a self-described Haredi, ultra-Orthodox Jew, do you identify with the State of Israel? Do you define yourself as a Zionist? The answer will be a most definite no. And if asked why, the answer will be very plain and straightforward. Because I believe in the Torah, I accept the Torah as the only framework and conceptual basis for a Jew's identity, whereas Zionism is based on altogether different premises. On the other hand, another section of the religious Orthodox world, known as the Mizrahi or the religious Zionists, felt compelled to play their role within the Zionist movement, even though they were a small minority, and their views and their concerns were as a matter of course, ignored. This is because, as expressed by one of their leaders, Harav Reines, for example, this was because of their correct perception of the terrible crisis in which the Jews, particularly of Eastern Europe, found themselves at that time. They therefore understood that this was an historical opportunity and that there was a clear imperative to create a reality and a place where Jews living under such conditions could flee. This was the motivation of religious Zionism from its inception. It was not a movement designed to bring about the ideal Torah state based on Jewish values and precepts something you might refer to as the redemption, the Geula. This was not the framework, this was not the vision of religious Zionism. This is something that came much later in certain parts of the religious Zionist world, but this was not the initial agenda and vision of religious Zionism. One of the first resolutions decided upon at the first Zionist Congress was that the Zionist movement had nothing to do with the Jewish religion, with the Torah. In the words of the resolution in Hebrew, En latzionut davar im hadat. Zionism has nothing to do with religion, with the Jewish religion. It follows, therefore, that religious Zionism had to deal with an inner contradiction from its very inception. On the one hand, they were part of the Zionist movement. On the other hand, they were religious Jews. The Zionist movement had declared itself to be completely unaffiliated with Judaism, with the Torah. It was disconnected and disinterested in the Torah, and therefore felt no allegiance to and no responsibility for anything the Torah has to say. On the other hand, these religious Zionists, they themselves were religious Jews. Their world outlook was ostensibly based on a Torah outlook. And therefore, religious Zionism, from its inception, had to somehow come to terms with this inner conflict, this contradiction. This glaring contradiction, which could hardly be swept under the carpet, was the essential reason that great rabbis such as Rav Kook, Rav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, could not identify as a Zionist, and for this very reason he took the Mizrahi, the religious Zionist faction of the Zionist movement, to task. Now, what happens when a person is forced to live in this state of inner conflict, where one's soul is torn between two masters? On the one hand, you have to toe the party line. You are part of the Zionist movement. On the other hand, you are a Torah Jew. How do these very different interests and perspectives, how can they be made to coincide? Well, the basic and obvious truth is that they cannot be made to coincide. They cannot live together in peace. And eventually one has to choose one's master. And over time, it became increasingly clear that religious Zionism chose the Zionist master over the Torah, the religious master. And this is also obvious from the term itself, religious Zionism. In other words, the noun is the Zionism. That is the essential identity. In Hebrew, this is referred to as Hatzionut Hadatit. That is to say, it is first Tzionut, Zionism, and then it's also Dati. Also, you place a kippah on its head, and you keep Shabbat, or you try to. You do what you can to remain religious, but your essential allegiance is to the Zionist movement, and then eventually what became the Zionist state, that is to say, the state of Israel. And over time, the inevitable happened. The belief in and the allegiance to the state took precedence, and essentially has always taken precedence within the religious Zionist world over the Torah, over any allegiance to the Torah. One can clearly observe this in all aspects of the religious Zionist world. 16 plus years ago, when Ariel Sharon's plan to destroy the Jewish towns and villages in Gush Katif, in the Gaza Strip, the leading rabbis in the Dati Leumi world, the religious Zionist world, such as Arav Shlomo Goren, who could certainly not be accused of not being Zionist enough. He was the first and almost legendary rabbi of the Israeli army for many years, Harav Avraham Shapira, who was the Rav Harashi, the chief rabbi, and the head of the well-known Merkaz Harav Yeshiva, Harav Shaul Yisraeli, who was likewise a well-known head of the religious Zionist world, and also one of the heads of that same yeshiva, Merkaz Harav, Harav Mordechai Eliyahu, who was also a chief rabbi and identified with the religious Zionist world, and others. All these leading rabbis expressed their halachic opinions in writing that a religious soldier must, in certain situations, refuse to comply with an order because that order contradicts a central precept of the Torah. Despite this fact, one could count the number of soldiers who actually behaved in such a way, who actually refused to comply with certain orders that were in opposition to the Torah. One could count those soldiers on 2 or 3 hands, quite literally. Because the vast majority of the rabbis of a younger generation in the religious Zionist world could not bring themselves to express this straightforward Torah position, which is explicitly mentioned in the Rambam, in Ilchot Melachim, in Maimonides' Code of Jewish law, that when the king orders a person, a Jew, to do something which contradicts the Torah, the person must refuse to obey the king's order. This is all part of the ideology of the religious Zionist world as it has developed and evolved over essentially the last century, and more particularly over the last several decades. The almost complete identification of the religious Zionist Jew, by and large, with some exceptions of course, with the state, with its political apparatus, with its government ministries, etc., is such that the notion that a Jew, a religious Zionist Jew, could actively oppose government policies and orders given by a military commander simply because they contradict the Torah or cannot be made to square with the Torah, such a notion is foreign and deeply disturbing to the vast majority of religious Zionist Jews. Essentially what we see is a kind of religious fascism or statism, whereby the religious Jew identifies with the state and the political infrastructure, and therefore all that the government states or claims must be accepted and must be believed. We see this clearly also with regards to COVID. The town in Israel with the highest percentage of injected children is the town of Efrat, a classic modern Orthodox religious Zionist township. The net result of this ideology and the way in which it has evolved over many decades is a complete self-satisfaction with the current state of affairs of the Jewish people, as opposed to perhaps many secular or somewhat traditional Jews, but those who do not identify as religious Zionists on the one hand, or the ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews on the other hand, both of whom may express opposition or lack of satisfaction with many aspects of Israel, Israeli society, Israeli governance. It is amongst the religious Zionists that we find the highest level of agreement, of compliance, of acceptance of the current reality of the Jewish people as being something self-evident and entirely reasonable and satisfactory. When it comes to such things, the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi world is clearly more healthy, more balanced, and more Torah-oriented. While it is certainly true that the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox world is seriously flawed in many ways, nevertheless, it is also true that precisely because they are not ideologically and emotionally invested in the current Israeli reality and in the state as it exists, precisely for this reason they are able to view reality, facts, and various phenomena from a more authentic Torah perspective. So, with regard to the question, what are the obstacles preventing the Jewish people from realizing their destiny? We must answer this question from three different points of view based on the three sectors of Israeli society that we mentioned earlier. That is to say, with regards to the secular and traditional part of the population, which is in fact a majority of the Jewish population of Israel, the problem in the first place is one of ignorance and complete lack of identification with the Torah and its most essential principles and concepts. And therefore, they cannot truly desire to make Israel a more Jewish state because they have no conception of what that might entail. With regards to the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community, who today are probably something approaching 15% of the population, the reason that they are not focused on how to bring about true change in the Jewish people's condition, how to redirect the Jewish state in a more Jewish, more Torah-oriented direction. The reason this is so far from them is because they expect these things to happen in some miraculous fashion. They expect things to simply fall from heaven, quite literally, and they do not consider it to be their responsibility, and therefore it's simply not a topic for discussion. With regards to the religious Zionist sector of the population, which is at most 25%, I estimate, the problem is precisely this self-satisfaction. Religious Zionist Jews have been trained, one could even say brainwashed, into accepting the current reality as some kind of ideal, or at the very least, a kind of situation, a kind of reality that will self-correct. I remember during my years studying the Mekaz Arav Yeshiva, one day a friend walked into my room, which is where I did most of my studying, and asked me a very simple question. He said, here in the yeshiva they tell us that this is Al-Khalta de Geula, this is the beginning of the Geula, of the redemption, the fact that we have a country, a Jewish state, we have an army, we are powerful. This is the beginning of the Geula, of the redemption. But, he went on to say, I don't see how we get from the present reality to the ideal Jewish state, which is spoken about here in the yeshiva. How is that going to happen? It was on that day that I began to realize that the yeshiva in which I studied at that time, Merkaz Arav, and the religious Zionist movement as a whole, truly had and has no answer to that question. Not the vaguest idea. It is simply taken on faith that this current reality, this current very un-Jewish, non-Torah and even anti-Torah reality will somehow morph into the sought for and hoped for Jewish state. That the Jewish people will somehow change direction. And this will happen in some almost miraculous and evolutionary manner. This is self-delusion. Such a thing cannot happen, because such things never happen by themselves. Significant changes occur in the life of a nation when there is a critical mass of people within that nation that is determined to make it happen. And therefore the self-satisfaction, the coming to terms with the current very, very unsatisfactory reality is the greatest enemy today of religious Zionism, and therefore of the Jewish people as a whole. Because the religious Zionist world should, on paper, should be the engine driving the Jewish people forward. Today, unfortunately, this is not the case. The religious Zionist world should not consider itself to have attained any great achievement if today we have a prime minister who wears a kippah, one should add a minuscule kippah, on his head. This should not be the definition of success for the religious Zionist world. A political leadership which claims to be religious and Zionist, but in fact is not part of the solution but part of the problem, which is simply more of the same, and in some ways even worse than that was before, is not the solution. This is not the direction that the Jewish people should be taking, and it is certainly not something that the religious Zionist world should be happy to accept. It is time for the Dati Leumi world to read once again and internalize the words of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah, to the people on Har Carmel. It states as follows. This is in Melachim Aleph, Perek Yod Heth, the first book of Kings, chapter 18, Pasuk Kaf Aleph, verse 21. Vayigash Eliyahu al kol ha'am. Eliyahu stood before the people. Vayomer, and he said, Ad mathai aten posahim ad shtei seipim. Till when will you go on limping along between these two opinions? Im Adonai ha'Elohim lechu aharo. If Hashem is the true God, follow him. Ve'im ha'Baal, but if it is the Baal, which was at that time the central form of idolatry current in the kingdom, lechu aharo, follow him. Ve'lo anu ha'am otho davar, and the people did not respond. The Baal referred to by Eliyahu can and should be understood as referring to all that is antithetical to the Torah, all that does not flow from the Torah, because everything that does not flow from the Torah eventually contradicts the Torah. Unlike our forefathers of old, who were confused, befuddled, did not know how to answer Eliyahu when he presented them with this plain and essential choice between following Hashem or doing something else. It is time that we today find our voice and respond that we wish to follow Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.